afternoon, and it is a great pleasure to be back in New Ross today with some old friends and some family. It is a great privilege to be back with you, and when I see a crowd so kind and welcoming as this, I think of a story my brother Bobby used to tell about Judge Miller, who was the only Republican I ever appointed to the bench on my second term. Judge Miller was a very heavy sentencer, and one day he was asked to tour the prison with some other judges, as they are often want to do, and he came across a day room of about 200 prisoners, about half of whom were serving his sentence. And to his surprise, the warden asked Judge Miller to say a few words to the crowd, and Judge Miller was at a loss for words. He first thought of beginning his remarks with fellow Republicans, but thought that probably wasn't going to work. Then he thought about saying fellow citizens, but most of the prisoners had left their citizenship rights at the door. So he was at a loss for words, as I say, and then he finally decided to begin his remarks with a phrase that public speakers use today, and which reflected Judge Miller's views of the prisoners who were in front of him. He looked down at the crowd and said, "It's nice to see so many of you here today." And so I certainly feel that way, but in a different context with all of you. And I do thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be with you here today, even if it involves breaking a promise to myself and my late wife, Jackie. When I completed my memoirs in 1971, after finishing my second term as president, my publisher insisted that I engage in a 65-city book tour to sell my book. It was a long and grueling exercise which required me to limit my remarks to about 20 seconds per book purchaser. Now, I could always make small talk as well as the next fellow, but 10,000 conversations of 20 seconds each was challenging even for an Irish politician. The constant protests outside of my book signings were dispiriting. Anti-communist right-wingers reminded everybody that Jack Kennedy had lost Vietnam and Southeast Asia by refusing to deploy the 500,000 troops that our military promised might finish the job. Well, as a naval officer whose boat was split in half in the Pacific in World War II, and as the commander-in-chief who survived a bullet through the neck in Dallas, I'm pretty sensitive to putting troops in battle. The military's assurance that 500,000 troops just might finish the job, when the 100,000 I already sent clearly couldn't, simply wasn't good enough for me. But we will talk about Vietnam and the rest all later. Right now, I should finish the story about the broken promise to Jackie. After the book signing tour in 1971, I promised Jackie that we'd remove ourselves from the public eye as much as possible. We had 2 children to raise. My brother Bobby and I had both been shot, and several of us Kennedys had received multiple death threats. The book signing tour had been a circus of protesters and police security, and both Jackie and I felt that raising our children on a farm in Virginia, where Caroline and Jackie could raise horses and I could do some writing, would be a good choice. So I promised Jackie that my tour days were over, and that future public appearances would be infrequent and well-spaced. Now, that was not too difficult a promise to keep, since my approval ratings at the end of my second term in 1968 were so low that I wasn't very much in demand even among Democrats. I have kept that promise to Jackie until now. It has been quite a few years since Jackie died in 1994, and given that I am now 95 years old, I recognize that speaking out now is my last chance to complete the historical record, especially since revelations about my personal life and infidelity during my presidency poisoned my image in ways I would like to address. Please forgive me this afternoon if I use notes and sit down occasionally while I speak with you. My eyes now need glasses, and I grew a beard while I lived in Ireland for 6 years, and we'll talk about that in a bit. At age 95, things tend to break down a bit, and my stamina is somewhat less than when I was president at age 43. It was great in those days to talk about the benefits of youth and vigor, but it would seem a bit silly pressing those matters at age 95. The back injury I suffered swimming to safety in World War II after my boat was sunk still plagues me, and sitting in a rocking chair from time to time is helpful. And my political career preceded the heavy use of teleprompters, so I'm a bit more comfortable reading to you and speaking with you today from notes rather than reading from a mirror. The 1960 campaign was a groundbreaking year and a groundbreaking campaign in American politics. It was the first year that television played a major role in an election campaign, and it was the first election dominated by candidates who were largely shaped by events of World War II and the Cold War. The Democratic primary was a crowded field, and given my youth, I was only 42 when I announced the presidency, and given my Catholic faith and my Boston accent, I realized early on that all of the Democratic primaries needed to be won to gain the Democratic nomination. I was up against some formidable candidates. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson skipped the primaries, but he was working the political bosses hard, and in those days the convention was largely controlled by the bosses, and the primaries were more of a beauty contest. Hubert Humphrey and Stu Symington were well-known and respected United States senators, and Adlai Stevenson was the darling of the liberal wing of the party, even though he was an unannounced candidate. After I prevailed in all the primaries and got enough of the big city bosses to come behind me to win the Democratic nomination, I faced a very formidable candidate in Vice President Richard Nixon. Mr. Nixon was a well-known individual across the country, had raised lots of money, and was a very tough campaigner. President Eisenhower, who he had served under, had been a very popular Republican president. We had an uphill fight. Now, I did have the benefit of my father's money, but he told me to spend it wisely and told me I don't want to pay for any damn landslide. In 1960, there was still a great deal of concern in some quarters regarding a Catholic as president. The most prominent minister in America publicly stated that he doubted the loyalty of any Catholic president. Even in recent years, we have heard similar murmurings about an African American, a Mormon, and Jewish candidates for president. I was required to speak directly to this issue before a convention of ministers in Houston. I hope you don't mind today my recounting some of those remarks and some of that speech, because it was so important in the election, is relevant today, and still describes my vision of America. Here is some of what I said that day to the ministers in Houston. While the so-called religious issue is necessarily and properly the chief topic here tonight, I want to emphasize that we have far more critical issues in the 1960 campaign: the spread of communist influence, the hungry children I saw in West Virginia, the old people who cannot pay their doctor's bills, the families who are forced to give up their farms, and America with too many slums, too few schools, and too late to the moon and to outer space. These are the real issues which should decide this campaign. And they are not religious issues. For war and hunger and ignorance and despair know no religious barrier. But because I am a Catholic, and no Catholic has ever been elected president, the real issues in this campaign have been obscured, perhaps deliberately in some quarters, less responsible than this. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, But what kind of America I believe? I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is an act against all. I believe in an America where intolerance will someday end, where all men and women will be treated as equals, where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no block voting of any kind, and where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews will refrain from attitudes of disdain and division and promote instead the American ideal of brotherhood. This is the kind of America that I believe in, and this is the kind I fought for in the South Pacific, and the kind my brother died for in Europe. No one suggested then that we may have some divided loyalty. And in fact, this is the kind of America where our forefathers died at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo. For side by side with Bowie and Crockett died McCafferty and Bailey and Carey. But no one knows whether they were Catholic or not, for there was no religious test at the Alamo. So I ask you today to follow in that tradition, to judge me on the basis of my record of 14 years in Congress. If I should lose on the real issues, I shall return to my seat in the Senate, satisfied that I tried my best and was fairly judged. But if this election is decided on the basis that 40 billion Americans gave up their right to be president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser, in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people. But if, on the other hand, I should win this election, then I shall devote every effort of mind and spirit to fulfilling the oath of the presidency, practically identical, I might add, to the oath I have taken for 14 years in Congress. For without reservation, I can solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, so help me God. That speech played a very pivotal role in the 1960 campaign. That election was the closest race in American history, and it wasn't decided until about noon the next day when it was conceded. We walked on eggshells that night and that morning after the election as we awaited word from Vice President Nixon whether he would challenge the election results because of our close wins in Texas and Illinois, which had been clouded by claims of election fraud by Lyndon's friends in Texas and Mayor Daley in Chicago, who incidentally told me after the polls had closed that, quote, with the help of a few close friends, we should carry Illinois. Needless to say, we all breathed a major sigh of relief when Vice President Nixon called the next day, conceding the election. As we formed our new administration, I was determined that our government would call upon the most brilliant and capable men available. Men like Dean Rusk, Bob McNamara, Doug Dillon, and the Bundy brothers were individuals of unquestionable intellect, competence, and integrity. Our government truly involved the best and brightest that America had to offer. I desperately wanted and needed my brother Bobby to be in a position where he could be my eyes and ears in the new administration. Finding the right place for Bobby in government was critical, because I knew that anywhere Bobby served would be criticized because of his inexperience. He was only 39 years old, as well as the fact that he was my brother. But given the array of talent in my administration, many of whom were Republicans, such as Bob McNamara and Doug Dillon, I figured that I would have enough credibility to appoint Bobby as Attorney General. I chose that position because Bobby, as Attorney General, would handle key issues which we needed to address, such as civil rights and organized crime. I also wanted J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to have to report to Bobby because I never trusted Edgar, which was a feeling shared by many in government. Now, everyone in government suspected that Hoover was spying on them, and later disclosures proved that to be largely correct. So having Bobby as Hoover's supervisor sounded just great to me, especially since I couldn't fire Hoover for political reasons. Lyndon Johnson put it very well to me about how to handle Hoover and whether to keep him as director of the FBI. Lyndon said to me, I'd rather have Hoover inside the tent urinating out than outside the tent urinating in. Now, of course, anyone who knew Lyndon knew that the word urinating was not in his vocabulary, and another more descriptive word was used in our conversation. So Bobby became Attorney General. When I made that announcement, I knew there would be outrage in some quarters, especially from the conservative members of the media. I decided to attempt to disarm that criticism with some humor by saying I simply don't see the problem with giving Bobby some experience as Attorney General who is out to practice law. Now, we were very quickly tested with the Bay of Pigs and Fidel Castro, and we unfortunately did, being objective, failed that test. History now refers to the Bay of Pigs incident as a disaster, and that term is accurate. Our decision to assist Cuban refugees to land in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs to attempt to overthrow Castro was based on unfortunate and frankly terrible intelligence, which assured us that the Cuban people would rise up in opposition to the Castro government once any organized armed opposition was in place. However, once that assumption proved inaccurate, the House of Cards immediately collapsed, and hundreds of brave Cuban freedom fighters were either killed, captured. In hindsight, I recognize that I trusted too completely capable, experienced, and qualified advisors without asking all the right questions. I learned the hard way that the best and brightest people can be totally wrong, and that it is the president's job, and the president's alone, to ask all the questions, especially the hard ones, about the worst-case scenarios. Now, about a year and a half later, Cuba reared its head again, and under the more different and dangerous context known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But before we faced the biggest crisis of our administration in Cuba in October 1962, we were confronted by other very serious issues. Civil rights played a huge role in the life of our administration. I fully supported the concept of desegregation in public schools and in all areas of public commerce. Our administration was committed to the passage of a comprehensive civil rights bill, but serious impediments stood in the way. First, a crucial part of the base of our Democratic Party and my election in 1960 was the Deep South, which traditionally voted straight Democratic, but which was adamantly opposed to desegregation in any civil rights bill. Southern Democrats such as George Wallace, who stood in the schoolhouse door to protest the federal court orders to desegregate the University of Alabama, threatened to derail the passage of any civil rights bill. Second, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn of Texas, was never a strong proponent of the civil rights bill, and he was upset that I wouldn't appoint his friend, Sarah Hughes, to the federal bench. Sarah was in her mid-60s, and I had an unwritten rule in my administration that as part of our commitment to youth and vigor, we would appoint individuals to the federal bench only who were 60 years or younger. We had trouble getting that civil rights bill moving in the House, but Sam Rayburn would do nothing to move that bill despite his role as Speaker of the House. Even though Sam wasn't crazy about the civil rights bill, he was still a national Democrat. and generally publicly supported the concept. So I sent my brother Bobby, who was our point man on civil rights, to speak to Sam Rayburn to ask him to get the House to move on our civil rights bill. When Bobby asked Sam Rayburn how we could get that civil rights bill moving, Speaker Rayburn said, well, it might move a little faster if your brother would appoint my friend Sarah Hughes to the federal bench. Now, Bobby was reluctant to tell Speaker Rayburn, who was 8 years old, that the reason Sarah hadn't been appointed was because she was too old, because she was in her 60s, and that I had this unpublished rule that I wouldn't appoint anybody over 60 to the federal bench. So Bobby, who was then 40 years old, kept it hard, and finally Speaker Rayburn just point blank asked Bobby, what do you have against Sarah Hughes? Bobby finally blurted out, we don't have anything against her except she's so old. Well, Speaker Rayburn straightened up his 80-year-old frame, looked at Bobby and said, Sonny, everybody looks old to you. And eventually, to appease Speaker Rayburn, I did finally approach Sarah Hughes to the federal bench. Now, all of these factors, however, convinced me that we could not and should not pursue a civil rights bill in my first term. So it wasn't until my second term that the Civil Rights Bill of 1966 was eventually passed, and for which I was very proud. One aspect of my presidency, which I thoroughly enjoyed, was my weekly press conference. No president before or since has been willing to expose himself to such extensive and frequent press inquiry. The give and take with the press provided me an opportunity to speak in an unfiltered manner with the American people every week, and I especially enjoyed my opportunity to poke a bit of fun at myself and others at the press conference. I remember one day when I was asked to comment upon a resolution passed by the Republican National Committee regarding my administration. Now, since I don't read fiction, I had not read it, and I asked the reporter what the resolution said, and he simply indicated that the Republican National Committee had voted that my administration was, quote, pretty much of a failure. I responded, well, I assume it passed unanimously. The Cuban Missile Crisis came upon us in October 1962 when we learned that the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba which were capable of striking the United States with nuclear weapons. I knew that we needed to take forceful action to remove those weapons, to remove and maintain the balance of power in the Cold War. However, the use of too much force could easily have started World War III, and the use of too little force could result in missiles in Cuba with a first strike capability that could destroy the east coast of the United States. These missiles promised to deeply upset the balance of terror, which had maintained a lack of nuclear war, and which had allowed a shaky and peaceful but steady coexistence with the Soviet Union since World War II. Now, many in our military lobbied hard for an immediate and overwhelming use of force against Cuba, which would include bombing their missile sites, airfields, and other crucial missile and strategic locations. The use of ground troops was also discussed. I'm not sure that's me, and I hope it doesn't mean that we're going to war. The use of ground troops was discussed and encouraged by many of the military officers. While I believe that we could successfully destroy Cuba's ability to launch a missile strike and could even overturn the Castro government with sufficient force, I knew that such an action would risk World War III and a nuclear war which would destroy civilization as we knew it. It would be a gross understatement to say that those 12 days in October 1962 presented the greatest risk to mankind which the world had ever experienced. We decided to take a middle ground in Cuba, which proved to be highly successful. We announced a naval blockade of Cuba while keeping aggressive military options open. We held our breath during the blockade, especially when Soviet ships were heading towards our naval vessels. In the end, we were able to broker a deal with the Soviet Union, whereby the Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba, our blockade was lifted, and we pledged not to invade Cuba again, which was something I had no intention of doing anyway. Vietnam proved to be an even tougher challenge than Cuba. Over the first 2.5 years of my presidency, we had increased and expanded our forces from about 2,000 in 1961 to 15,500 in 1963. We referred to these troops as advisors, and our goal was to keep them out of combat activity, but inevitably some of them were drawn into live fire activities. Now, in 1963, it was clear that we were losing ground in Vietnam. Our commanders constantly asked for more troops, and point blank told me that without more troops, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos would all be lost to the communists. The requests and predictions became more intense toward the end of my first term in 1964, but we were able to defer those decisions until early 1965. And we will get back to Vietnam in a few minutes when we discuss my second term. But first, I'd like to talk with you about the events of November 22, 1963. That day was a pivotal moment in my life and my administration. Even though I had served in combat in World War II and my boat was sunk and my life seriously threatened, I was not previously wounded. Being shot as Commander-in-Chief was an entirely different experience. I was very fortunate to have survived the gunfire in Dallas. The first and third shots both missed, and the second shot went through my neck, but obviously didn't kill me. Of course, it did alter my voice a bit and scared the daylights out of me and Jackie and wounded Governor Conley of Texas. But all of us survived. I wish I could say more for Officer J.D. Tippett of the Dallas Police Force, who was the only one who died that day at the hand of Lee Harvey Oswald. After Oswald was convicted and sentenced to death for murdering Officer Tippett and wounding myself and Governor Conley, he made claims the week before his execution that he had been hired by operatives of Fidel Castro. I was then in the unenviable position of having to recommend to Governor Conley of Texas that he defer the execution of a man who had shot him and me so the FBI could investigate this claim. After the FBI looked into Oswald's story and decided there was nothing to it, and Oswald was then executed in 1965, but he was still claiming to have been part of a broad conspiracy. While some people may still believe that, I personally place no stock in the conspiracy theories. The biggest impression upon me from being shot was from the faces I saw at Parkland Hospital and while I recuperated. My wife, Jackie, my children, Caroline and John Jr., and my military guards all much come to mind. As I recuperated in the White House, at the hospital, and later in the White House, I concluded that I had allowed far too much risk to enter into my life. After my second term, the press exposed my risk-taking and my marital infidelities that occurred in my first term before Dallas. And perhaps the most positive aspect of without that pretty extreme wake-up call, I might have continued to put my wife, my family, my career, and my country at risk, and I am grateful that I was able to become a somewhat better man because of it. I began to spend more time with my children and constantly warned them against a risky lifestyle. I was especially gratified years later when I was able to talk John Jr. out of flying an airplane. His presence and the presence of Caroline in my life is a great comfort to me every day. The faces of my military guards in the weeks that followed my shooting also convinced me that we should not put our armed forces in harm's way unless absolutely necessary. I came to the firm conviction that it was my responsibility to take steps to reduce our exposure of our troops to armed conflict. The 1964 election was a classic liberal-conservative battle. No one ever doubted Barry Goldwater's conservative credentials, and there was little doubt about my liberal leanings, even though I kept Lyndon Johnson on the ticket, despite liberal opposition to Lyndon in the Democratic Party. Now, in 1964, liberal was still a positive word for most Americans, and was not a label that Democrats ran from. I considered Barry Goldwater a good friend from our days in the Senate, and we recognized that someday we might run against each other for president. Because I had a lead in the polls, my re-election team regretted my pledge to Barry that I would engage in debates across all regions of the country, and Barry wasted no time in reminding me in the public of that pledge. But I felt comfortable that my experience of sparring with the media at weekly press conferences, together with Barry's extensive history of putting his foot in his mouth, would allow us to do well enough in the debates to uphold my promise. And fortunately, I turned out to be right on both counts. The debates allowed me to present a more presidential posture than Barry's very casual and off-the-cuff Southwestern style. The comment he made in the debates about his willingness to, quote, lob one into the Kremlin and to, quote, bomb Russia back to the Stone Age didn't sit well with most independents, and especially women who were concerned about their children being vaporized in nuclear war. Pretty much everything broke our way in the 1964 election to allow us a comfortable margin of victory. It provided a reasonable mandate to us to move ahead with civil rights, health coverage for the elderly, expanded aid to education, and a moderate foreign policy. When my second term began, my first order of business was Vietnam and Southeast Asia. It was now clear that South Vietnam was in grave danger of falling, and that communist inroads were likely to result in the collapse not only of South Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos if we did not intervene. Before the election, our generals had pushed hard to expand our troops from 15,000 to 100,000 and wanted me to authorize these troops to engage in combat. Now, I was able to defer that decision until after the 1964 election. But in the first few months of 1965, our generals emphasized that without this huge infusion of troops, Vietnam would collapse by the summer, and Laos and Cambodia by the end of 1965. This was one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, as the Cold War was very hot in the eyes of most Americans. And I vividly remembered how Harry Truman had been blamed for losing China to the communists, even though there was nothing he could have done to prevent that communist takeover in 1949. I also recognized that the infusion of a huge number of American troops in Korea from 1950 to 1953 resulted only in stalemate, and our troop levels in Korea eventually totaled 500,000 men. And Vietnam was a tougher place to fight, with a war that promised to be unconventional and lengthy, with an emphasis on guerrilla warfare and wearing out American resolve. I asked the Joint Chiefs and Staff over and over again whether the 100,000 troops they requested would preserve a pro-American government in South Vietnam and neutral governments in Laos and Cambodia. The Joint Chiefs told me that they were confident that 100,000 troops would do that job. So in early February of 1965, I acquiesced in their request, and within 3 months, we had 100,000 troops in Vietnam. I did not allow the use of air power against North Vietnam, as I feared such a move would invite the entry of China and perhaps even into the war in Vietnam. However, by August of 1965, it was clear that our 100,000 troops could not even begin to stem the tide in Vietnam, and the Joint Chiefs asked that this number be expanded by 250,000 by the end of the year. At that point, I had to decide if we were going to unilaterally save South Vietnam, and with it Cambodia and Laos, by committing enormous numbers of American troops to fight the war for the South Vietnamese. Most of my national security team pushed hard for the infusion of additional troops because they all felt that the loss of Southeast Asia would be too great a blow for the free world during the Cold War and would diminish American prestige to the point where communists would be encouraged to pursue additional wars in Thailand, Indonesia, Africa, and even South America. Now, because President Eisenhower had such broad experience in both military and presidential affairs and had inherited the war in Korea, I felt that I should invite him to the White House to discuss the situation. That meeting was a huge disappointment. By this point, Ike was very old and gave no meaningful insights. He just kept saying over and over that this was an extraordinary problem and possibly insurmountable. I wanted to respond, I know that, but decided to listen politely until it was time for Ike to return to his home in Gettysburg. Eventually, it was my brother Bobby who convinced me to let Southeast Asia go. Bobby felt that the request of an additional 250,000 troops would not be the last request, and that it would take at least 500,000 men to stabilize Vietnam. The two of us now believe that this infusion and influx of troops was no guarantee of success in Vietnam, and probably wouldn't save Laos and Cambodia. My own experience in World War II, and having been shot, also played a role in my thinking, as did conversations with my military guards for my hospitalization, two of whom had served as advisors in Vietnam and had no confidence in the ability of the South Vietnamese army to defend its own country. My meeting with the Joint Chiefs and National Security Council in early September 1965 was itself a battle. I bluntly informed them that we would not pursue the policy that they were supporting. Only Bobby, Dean Rusk, and Bob McNamara knew of my plan going into the meeting. I would agree to send an additional 30,000 troops to Vietnam for a period of 1 year, during which we would intensively recruit and train the South Vietnamese army. And in late 1966, we would begin a withdrawal from Vietnam over a period of 18 months. The South Vietnamese army would either sink or swim. We would provide air support within the borders of South Vietnam to assist the South Vietnamese army and provide all necessary training to use the generous weaponry we provided the South Vietnamese army. After our withdrawal, we would continue to provide air support within South Vietnam for a period of 2.5 years, after which the South Vietnamese Air Force would take full responsibility for the airspace over South Vietnam. All American combat forces would be withdrawn from South Vietnam by late 1967, and I left open the possibility that some advisors could remain in Vietnam after our ground forces left the country. The Joint Chiefs and National Security Council were stunned and argued vehemently that the results of this policy would be catastrophic and would involve not only the loss of Southeast Asia, but also result in communist aggression throughout the rest of the globe. But my mind was made up. I was not going to send thousands of Americans to a swamp on the other side of the globe to defend a country which cared less about its government than we did. I would take the heat for losing Southeast Asia if that was the case, although I felt we could blame South Vietnam for not having gotten its own act together to defend itself. But I simply would not preside over the loss of tens of thousands of Americans for such a cause. Unfortunately, the failure of the South Vietnamese to defend itself was exactly what happened. It did not take long for South Vietnam to begin to fall. By early 1966, over half of South Vietnam was held by Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnam soldiers posing as Viet Cong fighters. We had been able to keep American soldiers out of most of the fighting, but it was clear that only a tremendous influx of American combat troops would stem the tide. The military repeatedly leaked to the press their demands for combat troops to, quote, save South Vietnam. My hope was that our troop levels would buy enough time so that sufficient South Vietnam forces could be trained to keep South Vietnam from falling into communist hands. But that scenario became increasingly untenable. The Republicans in Congress and the hawkish Democrats constantly portrayed our administration as weak and soft on communism. So my choice in 1966 became clear. Either hasten our withdrawal from Vietnam or change course and commit 500,000 American troops for God knows how long, and with tens of thousands of casualties to prop up a corrupt South Vietnamese regime which had never been able to stand on its own. If we withdrew, we would simply hope for the best and know that when Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia probably fell, I would be responsible for its loss in the eyes of the American people. Perhaps the hardest part of this decision was that history would likely judge me in a cruel manner, as no historian could predict what would have happened if 500,000 American soldiers had been committed to Vietnam. Might it have allowed South Vietnam to have become a strong and independent democratic government like South Korea, which was the only historical analogy even close to Vietnam? This was my terrible dilemma, made worse for me that I had been a winner all my life. I had never lost an election and had been successful in every endeavor I had pursued. But I was not willing to let thousands of young men be killed and maimed in a fruitless mission so that Jack Kennedy could maintain his winning streak. Despite our opposition in Congress and the public and many members of my cabinet, we began our withdrawal in March of 1966. This was popular only among the most liberal members of the Democratic Party and seriously threatened my capacity to lead on other issues such as civil rights, the economy, and the Cold War. Everywhere that American troops withdrew and South Vietnamese troops were expected to fight and defend Vietnamese soil, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese rapidly and successfully defeated South Vietnamese troops. By early 1967, our troop strength was at 75,000 and the South Vietnamese government controlled only the capital of Saigon and other cities. I rejected renewed calls from the military and the right wing to commit 250,000 troops to shore up South Vietnam. And I announced that our withdrawal was in fact going to proceed ahead of schedule to permit an orderly withdrawal of American troops. I emphasized with all the time and training and material necessary to defend itself, and that America should not defend a country that was less willing to defend itself. So by June 15 of 1967, all American troops except those attached to our embassy were out of Vietnam. It was excruciating to see 500 American tanks and 200 American airplanes fall into communist hands in early December 1967 when Saigon fell. And within 6 more months, Laos and Cambodia also had communist governments. The failure of Vietnam overshadowed successes that we enjoyed in my second term. The economy was thankfully strong, fueled by a tax cut I pushed through Congress, and I was particularly proud that we were able to pass a civil rights bill in the summer of 1966 before we lost our majority in the Senate in the 1966 elections. At long last, all black Americans were fully equal in the eyes of the law and could no longer be refused service at public establishments or the right to vote. Vice President Lyndon Johnson played a key role in obtaining the support of border state Democrats and some moderate Republicans in favor of the Civil Rights Bill. And we had to make a number of those moderate Republicans look like heroes in order to get the bill passed. We were able to diffuse many aspects of the Cold War by negotiating an expanded test ban treaty, which prohibited all testing of nuclear weapons for 5 years from the signing of the treaty in 1967. This ban on testing set the groundwork for future arms control talks in every administration which followed. But this treaty was assailed by right-wing members of Congress, and together with our loss of Southeast Asia, these issues drove the campaign of 1968 and laid the groundwork for the election of Richard Nixon as president. The 1968 campaign was perhaps the low point of my life. Even though I was not a candidate, no election has ever been more heartbreaking. Richard Nixon obtained the Republican nomination for president by running a campaign that could best be labeled, "I told you so," in 1960. In 1960, Richard Nixon's focus had been on the fact that he viewed me as too young and inexperienced to be president. And in 1968, he pointed to the loss of Southeast Asia, Bay of Pigs, and what he called a sellout test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, as proving that we had been soft on communism and that Democrats could not be trusted with foreign policy. The Democratic nomination was up for grabs, and Vice President Johnson was the initial frontrunner. My brother, Bobby, wanted to run against Lyndon for the nomination, but I was vehemently against Bobby running. First, my popularity ratings were low, with only about 25% of the public approving my performance. Naturally, Bobby was going to be linked to every real and perceived failure of my administration. Second, I felt some sense of loyalty to him for hanging with me in a great many tough times. Even though he completely disagreed with my policy regarding the war in Vietnam and wanted to expand that war, he never did anything to criticize me or my administration, either publicly or privately. I felt I owed Lyndon at least my neutrality in the Democratic primaries, and I begged Bobby not to run. It caused real friction between us, Bobby and me, even though we were as close as brothers and friends could be. Eventually, I told him I would not stand in his way, but would not support any candidate. Bobby was deeply disappointed, but announced his candidacy in early January of 1968, which set up a contest between my vice president and my brother. This situation was even harder because these two men hated each other and always did. Now, Bobby ran unopposed in the New Hampshire primary, and the first contested primary against Lyndon was scheduled for West Virginia, where they would go head-to-head. But after Bobby won New Hampshire without opposition, Lyndon suffered a minor heart attack. Lyndon had suffered a prior heart attack in the 1950s while he was in the Senate, and his father died of a heart attack at a very young age. So Lady Bird begged Lyndon to give up his quest for the presidency, and Lyndon relented. So now Bobby had a clear path for the Democratic nomination. I recommended to Bobby that he maintain a low profile and let the Republicans spend their money and beat up on each other in the primaries. But my poll numbers were so low that Bobby felt he needed to be aggressive and needed to be out on the campaign trail to polish the Kennedy image and roll up big margins against token opposition in the Democratic primaries. I believe that decision cost him his life. When Bobby was shot and killed after the California primary, any joy remaining in public service left him. I had lost a devoted brother, my best friend, my closest political advisor, my attorney general, and I became a surrogate father to 12 children, all in one day. That loss was greater than words can ever describe. Any pleasure I obtained from public service ended on that day, and I felt that much of the rest of my presidency was the equivalent of sleepwalking. And on top of all that, my Democratic Party was in terrible shape. It had lost its two top candidates and was scrambling to find a candidate for November. Frankly, I didn't care too much who we picked. And when the party settled on Hubert Humphrey to run against Richard Nixon, that was fine with me. I did not expect my Democratic Party to look to me for much help, because the loss of Southeast Asia had hurt my poll numbers across the country, and the South hated me because of the Civil Rights Bill. With only 25% of the country approving of my performance, no Democratic candidate wanted me anywhere near them. A decision was made by the party not to invite me to the Democratic convention, which hurt me greatly. And matters became much worse when the entire focus of the Nixon campaign was his drumbeat that the country made a huge mistake in 1960 when it elected young and inexperienced Jack Kennedy. And now it was time to let Dick Nixon clean up the mess I made. I was forced to endure Richard Nixon's inauguration and attempt to stand by with some measure of dignity as Nixon was sworn in to succeed me. Believe me, that was a very difficult day, filled with much emotion and regret. The decision of where to live in 1969, after 8 years as president, with Jackie, Caroline, and John, was hard. The children were ages 11 and 8. I hadn't lived in my hometown of Boston for many years, and Jackie and I had never established a genuine full-time residence in Massachusetts, and the cold winters there did not appeal to her. So we bought a farm in Northern Virginia, where Jackie and Caroline could ride horses, and I could make an occasional appearance in Washington if the mood struck me, and stay in contact with my brother Teddy, who was serving in the Senate. The farm provided a quiet place for me to write my memoirs and to begin the process of trying to reconstruct my good name and a decent legacy as president. My memoirs were published in late 1971, and I embarked in a book tour in January of 1972. My publisher believed that a book tour during the primary campaign of a presidential election season would be good for sales, and I agreed that this timing sounded good. President Nixon was a lock to receive the Republican nomination, and the Democratic field was wide open. Talk of drafting Teddy as a candidate was squelched by Teddy, and I was thankful for it, because I certainly did not want another Kennedy-Nixon election in my lifetime. But Nixon was in for a tough primary fight against any Democrat because the economy was doing badly, and this time Richard Nixon had no one to blame but himself and his Republican cohorts. But that never stopped Dick Nixon, and he didn't have to look far for a scapegoat. And again in 1972, he diverted people's attention, and that scapegoat was me. I had been out of the public eye for nearly 4 years until I started my book tour in January of 1972 to promote the book. I didn't really like doing it, but it was a necessity for any public figure selling a book. Even though I had no financial need to sell the book and was donating the proceeds to charity, I still needed to fulfill my commitment to the publisher to appear at book signings, on talk shows, and in the lecture circuit. At this point, the Nixon crowd began to leak White House logs that showed the many times that Judith Campbell had visited me while I was in the White House, usually while Jackie was away. The reports of that affair, and some others, were first published in the tabloid newspapers, but once they hit the newsstand, the mainstream media could not avoid that story. Some members of the mainstream media had known of my infidelity for years and kept it quiet, but now they had no choice but to report it. And soon after, reports of the fact that I had Addison's disease and had concealed it also broke. The fact that that disease was well controlled didn't stop the media. Now, naturally, the reporting of this affair and other infidelities were extremely painful to Jackie and my children. The claims about me and Marilyn Monroe simply were not true, but the reports about Judith Campbell and a few others were mostly accurate. Jackie had been aware for years of at least some of those improprieties. After Dallas, the infidelities had ended, but the public disclosures in 1972 were terrible. And it, of course, had just the impact that Dick Nixon wanted, because now he was able to run as Dick Nixon, a family man with family values, against Jack Kennedy, who lost Southeast Asia and was a man without any values. The fact that Nixon was really running against George McGovern, Democratic nominee, and who was probably the most decent man I'd ever met, didn't faze Dick Nixon because he would do anything to win. And that included burglarizing the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate building, which was a blunder that later cost him his presidency. Needless to say, after Dick Nixon was impeached and resigned in the Watergate scandal in 1974, there were not too many tears in the Kennedy household. Now, the succession of presidents which followed Dick Nixon was far more gracious to me. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush all provided me with excellent security briefings and periodically called for my perspectives on various issues, and especially foreign affairs. When Ronald Reagan became president, he was 69 years old, yet I was only 63 and had already served as president for 8 years. I had long ago made peace with Jackie and my children over my personal mistakes, and both Caroline and John Jr. had married well, and both couples made me a grandfather. After years of avoiding the spotlight, by the 1980s I could actually go out in public without people asking me which country I had lost to communism that day. The fact that we were prosperous during my 8 years as president, when compared to Nixon's disastrous economic policy, helped my image bid, and I believe that some members of the public had sympathy for the invasion of privacy by Nixon and the press. And that sympathy was enhanced when Nixon's true character was exposed to the Watergate hearings. When Jackie got sick in the early 1990s and died in 1994, a large piece of me died with her. She was loyal to me when I did not deserve loyalty. She was an incredible mother to our 2 children in the early years when I wasn't present much as a father, and she was a pillar of dignity when the world around us had no civility. I was enormously touched when all of the former living presidents came to her funeral, even Dick Nixon.